Welcome everybody to the session on labor markets. I'd like to express my gratitude to the ERF for inviting me to chair today's session, and I look forward to having a fruitful discussion with both the speakers and the lead discussant. I'd like to start immediately with our first paper, which will be by Dr. Suleiman Al-Qudsi, along with a long list of co-authors. And he is, I would like to give both you and then subsequently Dr. Amira 20 minutes to do your presentation, and then that will leave time for the discussant and for the Q&A. Thank you, Dr. Suleiman, go ahead. You're on mute, Dr. Suleiman.
Okay, I'm okay. All right. Well, thank you so very much for your intro, and thanks to ERF for hosting this. Let me start off by saying that the paper on labor markets that I'm going to be presenting is part of a packaged project that is for policy purposes. It's been done on a fast track. The project lasted for 5 months, included a large number of people, and hence the names of authors. And the project was funded by the Kuwait Foundations for the Advancement of Sciences under the Corona Proposal 92 grant name. Now then, there were chunks of this project that were at the macro level, and my colleague, the distinguished Dr. Ali Jilan, talked about the macroeconomic impact using the CGE model. Then there was a piece that was done on the health cost of the pandemic. A third component is on the labor, which I'll be presenting, and the total labor productivity and total factor productivity, and what is the vision and implications post-corona. Then there was a component on the hesitancy and because of the uncertainty surrounding the pandemic in terms of consumption on the household consumption side, as well as on the private investment sides. So the project handled that as well. And then, of course, the government interfered in terms of mitigation and stimulation package, and that was targeted to the disadvantaged in particular, but also there was a cost involved. So the last component of the study was about the fiscal side. And then we had a grand finale about what does it add up to from the policy perspective, given that the corona accelerated the technological progress and the innovations, the automations, and remote working, and consuming from distance or online consumption and delivery and what have you. Now then, what we looked at first at is the number of workers that have been working in Kuwait over the past 50 years on a quarterly basis, and link that to the chronology of the growth cycles in Kuwait, i.e. we're able to, using the methodology similar to the NBER, to identify the recession dates in the history of Kuwait, including the 2008-2010 that occurred in Kuwait. And the reason for this was we wanted to compare what happened in 2020 with previous recessions. And not unsurprisingly, or not surprisingly rather, the current recession is deeper, harsher, had ravaging effect on almost every corner in the economy, and affected the labor markets of Kuwait. And the labor market, as we all know, is made up of two components, the Kuwaitis and non-Kuwaitis, and the effect on the non-Kuwaitis was much harsher. But its effect was not only on the labor market, because we had another survey on the households, and we came to find out that about 30%, 25 to 30% of Kuwaiti households were actually impacted negatively by the coronavirus. So we also had the labor force survey component. We had three surveys: the CEO survey, the household survey, and the labor force survey. And the labor force survey also indicated that there was direct and harsh, the vagaries were substantial, and the ravaging as well. What we learned from these surveys is threefold. Number one, that the pandemic was impactful. Okay. Secondly, that the agents were cognizant of its presence. And that cognizance translates into productivity, whether in the CEO survey, or the labor force survey, or in the household survey. There were cognizant CEOs were cognizant of the technical progress that accelerated during the pandemic, the online working that happened, and online purchasing and delivery for the households. And then the workers indicated that there is need for training, okay, in order to catch up with tomorrow's type of jobs. So the third aspect is the policy. We know that in many countries, particularly the advanced economies, the United States, the EU, and others, labor share has been declining. And in the context of the pandemic, there is a movement to replace workers with machines, or i.e. automation. And the implications is that the labor share is going to decline in the post-corona pandemic era, all right? And so far, when we examined the establishment surveys, we had data on establishment surveys from 2003 to 2018. We found that labor share in Kuwait was constant, more or less, between 40% to 42% in these private sector establishments. And in each establishment, there is 6,000 companies. Now then, if I may go to the slide number 6. I'm sorry, I'm not showing it on from here, but I was told that you guys can have it from your end. We found that in the CEO survey, there was the coronavirus impacted sales to the tune of 85% of the companies that were surveyed. All right. So 85% of the CEOs said that we lost a lot of bit of sales, correct? In terms of the cumulative impact, and the difference between cumulative impact and the initial impact is because we asked them, what was the initial impact of the coronavirus on you? And said, really shocked us, 85%. So then, and then we asked them after 3 months, and they said, well, it's still very impactful. It's 77%. So 77% of the CEOs said that they had, they still were suffering from the impact of the coronavirus. Now, we know that labor demand is a derived demand. Okay, so what happened in Kuwait is in the private sector, because of lost sales, reduced revenues, no cash for particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, they ended up letting go some of the workers. In fact, some of the firms closed down altogether. 60% of the Kuwaiti workers were impacted negatively, i.e. they were let go. In the case of non-Kuwaitis, the CEOs indicated, 66% of the CEOs indicated that they shed off some non-Kuwaiti workers as a result. Now then, we try to estimate, this is in slide number 10, to estimate what we called a pseudo-elasticity of demand for labor based on the responses of the CEOs, because we had questions about how much did your revenue change by, and then we had questions about how much did your demand for labor change by, and accordingly we came up with very rudimentary estimates of the elasticity. In the case of non-Kuwaiti workers, it is about 0.4. In the case of Kuwaiti, in the case of non-Kuwaiti workers, it's about 1.757. In the case of Kuwaitis, it's much less. Demand is inelastic, that is for Kuwaiti workers. Now, not only that, but we asked them, as the CEOs, what do you expect the technology that is looming on the horizon will have on your employment of workers? And again, we found that technology is going to be impacting the labor market, particularly the non-Kuwaiti component. There will be shedding a lot of non-Kuwaiti workers, but there will also be some negative impact in terms of reducing Kuwaiti workers. In the case of Kuwaitis, about 60%. In terms of non-Kuwaitis, about 63%, which is quite impactful, actually. All right. We had, of course, a lot of detail about how the impact varied according to industrial sector, in terms of the type of activity that the firm is in, whether it is small, medium size enterprises, larger firms, or whether it is in the private sector, in the joint sector, or in the government sector. Firms that are in the private sector were impacted much more than those in the joint and in the government sectors, and probably not surprising. Now, with that, let me move on to our analysis of the labor productivity, and this directly answers and agrees with what was mentioned with regards to the labor and total factor productivity. And I concur with what Dr. Ali Jilan said, that our question was sort of policy type of question. What if productivity increases by 10%? We know that the time it takes time for such a policy for such an increase in productivity to occur. We say, okay, we know that productivity is declining in Kuwait, and we have estimated that. But if we were to succeed in raising productivity, what would happen to our ability to handle crises, okay, and shocks, given that the Kuwaiti economy is subject to a lot of volatility, recurrent volatility, right? So what we found out, we used firm level productivity estimates and the Ackerberg type of analysis. Yeah, we're now on slide 13, please. Thank you. Yes. And what we, in terms of labor productivity, whether it is in the agricultural or mining sector, construction and manufacturing, the blue line shows the rate of increase or change in labor productivity, and most of the time, unfortunately, it is it's trending downwards. The next slide shows the total factor the labor productivity in the wholesale trade and restaurants and the transport, as well as in other activities and the whole sectors. And if the last one, the one on the right bottom, there is a decrease in total factor productivity over time, with a little bit of spikes that occurs because we are I might mention here that we didn't adjust because of lack of data for the number of hours of work, but this is actually the value added divided by the number of workers that are working in each sector.
Dr. Sulaiman, you have 5 minutes left.
5 minutes left. That okay? All right. Move to. Thank you very much. Move to slide. The next slide, please. And this is an important takeaway. Labor productivity in the context of Kuwait has been increasing at a rate of 2.1%, but the average wage was increasing at double that, at about 4%. All right. I will skip, for the sake of time, the distribution of productivity growth over sectors, but the picture remains the same. That is of a declining pattern. Wages are higher, and if we look at the industrial sector, for example, the petroleum and gas sector, slide 18, page 18. We find that even in the bread and butter sector of the Kuwaiti economy, productivity has unfortunately been declining over time. So this is slide 18. Yes, that's the one. Now then, what do we do with all of that? We went back to the scoring board and asked our CEOs, well, there is an obvious need for productivity increase. Do you see that you'll be using or employing tools, equipment, artificial intelligence, more online and office work and so on, robots in the future? And we were surprised that a lot of them answered, yes, we are cognizant of this. We know that this is a trend that will be. So this gave us another reason to feel that, hey, maybe the productivity increase will come from the private sector because they want to keep up with, to improve their profit. So in slide number page number 19, please. Yes, thank you. We asked the CEOs about artificial intelligence, and do you think that you would be employing or needing to employ to use artificial intelligence and hence train your workers? And some 88 CEOs said yes, we will, and 30 said no. They are not going to deploy it. Ditto for online type of whether it's working or office machinery, and ditto for robots. So the Kuwaiti CEOs seem to be cognizant in their mindset, in the challenges that they see ahead is that they have to increase productivity using perhaps using the new tools that science and innovation is advancing in the working place and in the production place.
And if we could come to your conclusion now, please, Dr. Sulaiman.
Yes, I am coming to that. Absolutely. We come to the conclusion that there is absolutely no alternative but to work productively, innovate, and raise total and labor productivity in the Kuwaiti economy. We have to jump, leapfrog in order to catch up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sulaiman. In my haste to start the session, I forgot to mention Dr. Sulaiman's affiliation. He's a principal research specialist at KISR, and that was a fascinating presentation concerning the opinions of a very large number of CEOs. And I look forward to the Q&A, which we'll be having after the next presentation. Our next guest is Dr. Amir Al-Haddad, who's a senior economist and researcher in the, well, I'll leave her to pronounce. I'm not German, I'm afraid, so perhaps you could translate it for us and as you start. Dr. Amira, you have 20 minutes, and I'll let you know when you have 5 minutes left. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Omar. I want to thank Dr. Ibrahim for his kind invitation, and Dr. Shireen, and the rest of the ERF team that I have worked with a lot over the years. And may I ask if you can see my slides? Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see them.
They're looking great. All right. So this presentation is about the micro and small and medium enterprises in the Arab region. It talks about structural vulnerabilities at a time of multiple shocks. The original work was done for Jordan and Morocco as well, but for purposes of time, as Dr. Shireen has mentioned, I will focus on the case of Kuwait. I'd also like to mention that this presentation is mainly descriptive, and sometimes we can gain a lot of insights from descriptive work, but it's just the beginning into more causal and methodological work. So I hope it will be useful. One moment. Just a second. I think I shared the wrong slides. I'm apologizing. Oops, oops, oops. No. Oh no, yeah, sorry, yeah. Okay, so this is the outline for the presentation. First, I'll very briefly introduce Kuwait and its micro and small and enterprise sectors, and then I'm going to present results based on the Banziri Public Relations Kuwait COVID-19 Business Impact Survey, which will cover firm closures and suspensions, revenue losses by firm size, transmission mechanisms of the crisis and operational challenges, and then the firm behavioral responses from layoffs to wage cuts, etc., and also coping strategies of firms by size. And then I'm going to move about perceptions of the government stimulus package of the firms and the firm's future outlook, their future transitions, will they sustain their behavioral changes? And then I'm going to finally present the last bit of the survey, which are the companies or the firm's policy priorities in a post-COVID world. And then I'm going to reflect on the Kuwaiti case study, looking more or focusing more on the structural vulnerabilities more than the short-term problems, perhaps. And then I'm going to offer some suggested reforms. So, as many of us know, Kuwait is a small high-income country with just 4 million over 4 million people. Kuwait is the third richest oil exporting country after Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. Its economy is almost entirely dependent on oil and gas. Oil exports account for about 90% of all merchandise exports, and that's around 37% of its GDP. Services dominate the Kuwaiti economy and accounts for about 3/4 of all employment, industry of about 1/4, which leaves a very small agricultural sector of just 2%. Kuwait has a substantial government sector that accounts for about 2/3 of the economy, which means that it has also a very small private sector, accounting for a little over 1/3 of economic activity. In terms of micro and small and medium enterprises, the country has one of the lowest micro and small and medium enterprise densities in the region, of just 12.2 enterprises per 1,000 people. Just to put this in perspective, the average in the Arab region as a whole is about double that, 23 per 1,000 people, and in oil exporting countries, that's 26.1 per 1,000 people, and in oil importing countries, 37, and in comparator regions such as Europe and Central Asia, high-income countries, 65, Eastern Asia and Pacific, 61, which is more than 5 times the density of Kuwait. MSMEs contribute just 3% of GDP compared to an average of about 50% in high-income countries. And they account for roughly 23% of Kuwait's workforce, about half of the average in high-income and emerging economies. Its total entrepreneurial activity indicator per 100 people of under 2 is just 20% of the world average, which is way below what is expected for a country of its income level. It is well established that the relationship between total entrepreneurial activity and GDP per capita takes a U form, meaning that the relationship is positive for higher levels of income, and Kuwait is clearly an exception to this overall pattern. So as I mentioned, the results here are based on the Banziri Public Relations Kuwait Enterprise Survey of 536 manufacturing and services enterprises. The survey was conducted in April of 2020, which means it covers the first wave of COVID. The sample covers only formal firms that were profitable prior to the COVID crisis. MSMEs are overrepresented, so large firms here in the first figure represent only 9% of the sample. Most sample firms are in services, mostly retail and construction, and only 8% of firms are in automotives and other manufacturing. as you can see from the second graph here. The overrepresentation of micro and small firms in the sample means also that a high proportion of the sampled firms are young. Here, sorry, my dog is barking. The summation of the first two columns, and which implies that about 60% of all micro firms are young firms, this red column here, and the same proportion of large firms are very old firms. This is sort of consistent with the stylized facts of industrial organizations, where smaller firms are younger and larger firms are mostly older firms. So about half of all surveyed enterprises have suspended or shut down their businesses. Of these suspended enterprises, just over half are micro, about 1/4 are small. In contrast, only 4% of all closures and suspensions were by large enterprises. So while 60%, while 60% of all micro enterprises, 60% of all micro enterprises and 70% of all small enterprises have shut down, only 23% of large enterprises have done so. In terms of sectors, the retail sector is the most affected of all closures, 27% of all closures, followed by construction and then professional services. In terms of revenues, overall revenues dropped by 80% for a quarter of respondents and by half for 9% of respondents. Revenues increased for a very small percentage of enterprises of about 4%. A larger share of 9% here, that one here, the purple one, a larger share of 9% of open, large and medium-sized enterprises experience an increase in revenue versus just 5% for micro enterprises. In terms of the transmission mechanisms of the crisis, as expected, micro and small and medium enterprises face more grave cash flow challenges than do large enterprises. So therefore, 27%, 35%, 24% of the micro, small and medium enterprises face challenges in access to finance or scheduled investor capital funding, compared with just 19% of large enterprises. In terms of the operational challenges, all enterprises were adversely affected by the lockdown, which topped all other operational challenges. This is the red column. So over half of all enterprises had problems delivering orders and meeting deadlines. But this problem of lockdown has slightly affected larger enterprises more than micro and small. The second most important disruption has been in the upstream and downstream chain. Again, this problem is most strongly felt by larger firms, here, the green column, by larger enterprises. In fact, for micro and small enterprises, it is the other reasons are the second most important problem for MSMEs, and unfortunately, these reasons were not named in the survey results. The next operational challenge, which was felt by all sizes, are the disruptions to logistics due to suppliers shutting down or suspending their operations. The unavailability of personal protective equipment was cited as a serious operational challenge, but by just 16% of the enterprises, though as a more serious one for the larger enterprises. Okay, how about the behavioral responses of the enterprises in response to COVID? So firms have responded to COVID by firing workers in Kuwait, by firing workers and giving them unpaid leave. It is also notable that the large enterprises have taken more actions in response to COVID-19 than have MSMEs. See, the columns for large firms are always higher than those for all other categories. A greater proportion of larger enterprises, exactly 29%, have laid off workers than have either micro, 12%, or small, 17%. Nearly a third of large enterprises have given unpaid leave, which is more than 1.5 times the share of micro enterprises doing so, and about double that of medium-sized enterprises, so double medium 15%. So both of these actions are, of course, against the Kuwaiti labor law. Larger enterprises were also more likely to have adjusted working hours. A partial explanation may be that family enterprises are more common among MSMEs, so family members keep working. We do not have more information to be able to say why this is so. In terms of the coping strategies, so to overcome the operational challenges that were presented before, many enterprises implemented coping strategies other than firing workers and cutting wages and reducing working hours. So again, larger enterprises are more likely to have adopted virtually every coping strategy response. The most common coping strategy across all sizes has been to ask the landlord for flexibility in paying the rent. The second most implemented coping strategy has been to move workers to remote working, but more so by the larger firms. The few micro and small and medium enterprises that work remotely are mostly in the professional services sector, as well as contracting and IT communication, so sectors that are able to easily be conducted online. Larger enterprises that work remotely, however, are in retail, presumably larger retail outlets, and very few are in manufacturing. Large enterprises are generally more likely to take out loans, and therefore negotiating more flexibility in loan repayments was large enterprises' third most important coping strategy. Micro and small and medium enterprises, on the other hand, increasingly transform the retail aspect of their activities into delivery and pickup options wherever possible.
I only have 5 minutes left.
Only? Okay, about to finish. So the least important coping strategy for all enterprises has been transforming the retail aspect into more digital and virtual platforms. Larger firms have adopted this strategy nearly twice as much as have micro and small and medium enterprises. I will skip the mode of operation. It basically says that larger firms would like to keep a skeleton staff in the office and send the rest of the workers at home. In terms of predictions, smaller enterprises are generally more optimistic than larger ones in terms of the duration of the negative impacts for COVID. And when asked when they expect the revenues to bounce back to their 2019 levels. However, all enterprises share a general negative outlook for the year 2020, but those whose revenues have risen during the crisis share a positive outlook. Okay. But when asked about how sustainable their businesses will be under the current conditions, so if the lockdown persists and all the stringent conditions continue, larger enterprises predicted a longer period of sustainability of 6 months to a year, whereas smaller enterprises predicted they will last less than 6 months. In terms of the likely transitions, half of the larger and medium-sized enterprises have realized that they can work with fewer people. But having already a limited number of workers, smaller share of micro and smaller enterprises indicate their intention to reduce employment and indicate that they will keep the numbers as they are. Only a smaller percentage, mostly those who experience stable or higher revenues, plan to increase employment. In terms of the supply chain, the majority, between 75% and 80% of the respective enterprise sizes, do not plan to make any changes to their supply chains. In terms of transformations to digital facilities, around 1.5 times as many large enterprises are already transforming into digital facilities compared with the proportion of micro and small and medium enterprises doing so. Half of the micro and small enterprises believe a digital transformation is irrelevant to their business, compared with just 31% of the larger firms. In terms of the stimulus package, Kuwait has implemented, as many governments around the world, a number of monetary and fiscal measures, reducing the interest rate, increasing financing limits, introducing a 6-month grace period, and those aimed at SMEs, increase their risk, reduce their risk rating from 75% to 25%, providing them with concessional loans with joint financing, postponing installments, postponing collections of social security contributions from businesses, but those who work in the oil sector, and some self-employed, and exemptions from some government fees. So how does the MSME sector in Kuwait view these measures? Familiarity, in terms of familiarity, most MSMEs are unaware of these measures. So either have entirely no knowledge or are not familiar. In contrast, 75% of the large enterprises are either somewhat familiar or very familiar, indicating that they may have received those benefits, or that at least that they are better informed. Substantial share of enterprises believe the government response to the crisis is poor, and that the absolute majority indicated that they were not helpful, the measures, particularly strong among the larger enterprises. The negative views held by many enterprises perhaps have to do with the constraints in relation to the benefits, which are the enterprise has to prove that adds value to the national economy, that it's creating national employment, that it has been profitable prior to COVID, that it has been affected by the lack of mobility, that it has never defaulted in any of the previous loan obligations, that it will not distribute any profits as dividends during the loan period. And of course, these conditions are designed to safeguard the lender from the risk of credit default, but they risk turning away the majority of prospective borrowers. In terms of whether firms believe SME policy is a government priority, about half of all firms believe it is not. Now,
finish up, Dr. Amira.
Okay. Okay, I'm not going to go into policy priorities, but mostly they want the rent to be paid, and larger enterprises would like to see the government to revisit the private sector labor law to include a force majeure clause. Okay, about to finish. So in the reflections on the Kuwaiti case study, so I'm going to go back to the social contract. So the impact of the double crisis indicated that larger and older enterprises have not been as severely affected as the smaller, more private sector-oriented MSMEs. And that the poor response of the MSME sector is a reflection of the fact that despite being very wealthy, Kuwait performs poorly in terms of diversification, enterprise density, especially of MSMEs, entrepreneurial activity, and the size of the private sector. So the question becomes, what reasons other than Dutch disease account for the structural vulnerabilities of the Kuwaiti economy? I'm going to name about 5 main reasons. So the first is the generous availability of lifetime secure government employment for all Kuwaiti nationals, and the nature of the Kuwaiti welfare state, which dampens the incentive for individuals to either engage in entrepreneurial and risky business activities, to seek additional private sector employment. So in the current social contract, Kuwait, as I think most of us know, presents subsidized basic food, free education, healthcare, making provisions for medical treatment and for studying abroad, allowances for wives and children. So this is the nature of the welfare state in Kuwait. Another break on private sector development is that foreigners cannot solely own companies in Kuwait, which means that Kuwait private entrepreneurs are protected from foreign competition by law, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they are entrepreneurial. So Kuwaitis can just act as a silent partner. A striking finding of the survey, which I think was also similar to what Dr. Sulaiman presented before, is that the fewer Kuwaiti employees an enterprise has, the more likely it is to have suspended its operations or shut down in response to the crisis, indicating that government support has favored enterprises with more Kuwaiti employees. An essential eligibility requirement to apply was the Kuwaitization policy quota. So these policies reinforce already excessive protection from competition given to Kuwaiti nationals and entrepreneurs. And the persistence of such policies and practices will only stifle the growth of the fledgling enterprises with serious implications for long-term efficiency. My last slide, before last. The government, the Kuwaiti government monopolizes another structural vulnerability, monopolizes a range of sectors from oil to aviation, to gas stations, to entertainment parks, and even movie theaters. These sectors are not natural monopolies, and there is no need for them to stay in public hands. The government and many parliamentarians are keen for the economy to stay in public hands in order to be able to control the patronage system from the distribution of rents and ensure political stability. The last structural vulnerability I'm going to talk about is franchising. Franchising in countries all over the world is an opportunity for micro and small businesses to thrive. It is not so in Kuwait. In Kuwait, multiple franchisees that cover all of Kuwait and beyond are exclusive to a single franchisee, which is not the model of these, like McDonald's, Burger King, Starbucks, all around the world have a different model of operation. Some powerful businessmen own not just the multiple outlets carrying a specific brand name, but those of more than one brand name. So all these government-backed monopolies are barriers to entry to potential successful micro and small and medium enterprise.
I think we have to stop there, Dr. Amira.
Okay, so I can go over the reforms that I'm suggesting maybe in the question and answer session. Thank you.
Now I'd like to switch to our lead discussant, Dr. Nader Kabbani from the Brookings Institute in Doha. Dr. Nader, if you could take 5 minutes to give your reflections on the two papers.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Omar. I'll try to be quick. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Ibrahim Al-Badawi, Dr. Fatima Shamsi, and the entire ERF team for putting this together. It's great that this has happened the second year in a row, even despite the COVID situation. So thank you very much. I know it wasn't easy. I'm going to, I guess, go over as quickly as possible some of key points and then open up for Q&A. It was a pleasure to read both papers and to see some of the major insights. Dr. Sulaiman Al-Qudsi's paper with his team was really very insightful. Both have extremely timely data to share. And let me just highlight a few key points. I'm first of all, with regard to Dr. Sulaiman's paper, I'm a big fan of these kind of blending survey data in a way that's similar to what the paper did, the TED paper, the paper did with the TED CEO survey. It allows for more timely and targeted analysis and provides policy relevant insights that often go missing if you kind of rely on traditional data. And obviously the time horizon is very different. That said, the CEO survey was very good because it focused on a specific group of individuals and provided insights from them. I'm less sure how useful the labor force and household surveys were that was also conducted as part of the paper. The sample sizes of 420 and 250 respectively, not sure really gave enough statistical power, especially regarding the household survey. A more interesting approach, maybe if the Kuwait Institute, the KISR worked in more close coordination with Kuwait Central Statistics Bureau or some other such entity to try to kind of focus on what they can do best, like a CEO survey, and then combine it as much as possible with labor force and household surveys. And that would possibly incentivize government agencies to kind of react in time to their efforts to get some policy relevant data during a period such as the pandemic. Turning to the results, I think it was really interesting to see the CEO's plans in terms of, well, first of all, the actions they took during COVID for reducing foreign workers vis-a-vis national workers, but even more so their plans for the future and more of a world that's more dominated by technology, artificial intelligence, and computer learning. And that raised a question for me. I mean, I know this is CEOs looking at their preferences and aspirations and directions for the future. But I mean, there's implications here. The main issues that the survey identified to hiring national workers were the high wages and benefits, as well as the skills gap. These issues remain in the context of a new digital economy. And to suggest that companies can simply replace foreign workers with technology, I think misses the point. What's going to happen is really, yes, computers and robots are going to replace more skilled workers, but the jobs created will require even higher level skills of tech savvy people who can then interface both with the technology and with the clients and customers. And these skills are not necessarily present currently in many of the national workforce that are, in the case of Kuwait, 80% are working for the public sector, or in terms of the cheaper foreign workers that are being brought into the Gulf countries to replace the higher wage workforce that exists. So the aspirations are there, but I'm not sure they align with the reality on the ground. And this is a question that I think the authors didn't really address. One of the key insights was really interesting, that was looking at the 2% annual growth in labor productivity as compared to the 4% annual increases in wages. And that suggests that the wages are not being driven by productivity considerations, but rather, as the paper points out, this is mostly going towards Kuwaiti nationals, and they're being driven by political considerations. So it's then hard to get to the discussion of how firms and the country can engage in what Dr. Suleiman calls productivity leapfrogging. That doesn't seem to align with what the CEOs are planning to do. They simply want to cut foreign workers, and that's going to affect productivity. And in fact, I recommend, to the extent possible, that authors can get additional data in the future to kind of treat this as a bit of a natural experiment. In the case of the Gulf countries, the pandemic really created an opportunity to see how companies and countries will react. If you can collect additional data, and I think this also applies to Dr. Amira Haddad's paper, if you can get additional data down the line and really see how these decisions at the company level and the policy level have affected productivity, it might provide some useful insights. My sense is productivity took a big hit because decisions were more political than they were actually economic in terms of who to retain. So that's briefly some comments on Dr. Suleiman's excellent paper. I really enjoyed it. I also enjoyed Dr. Amira Haddad's paper, and I have a version that's I guess slightly, the data presented in the analysis is more detailed and comprehensive than what she presented than what I had. So I'll reflect only on a few key points that were raised. First of all, I know she only presented data for Kuwait, but the survey data that they have also includes Jordan and Morocco and possibly Lebanon. If there are going to be cross-country comparisons, the timing is very important. In Kuwait, it was April 2020, and Morocco and Jordan, it was more August to December. And so the implications obviously are very different. And the sample side, the sample frame was also very different. So I'm glad she only focused on Kuwait, because that I think made sense in and of itself. The second key point, I mean, it was really interesting to see some of these results, and especially the situation in Kuwait vis-a-vis micro, small, and medium enterprises, and the very low level of entrepreneurship activity in the country. And this relates a lot to some of the outcomes that they measured. The data is very rich in terms of policy responses, and I think the authors still need to unpack some of the results and put them in a policy, in more of a policy framework. And I think she's done an excellent job in the presentation. And I look forward to maybe she get a chance to delve more deeper into some of the policy recommendations that she had at the end that she didn't have a chance to get to. One thing I just leave her with is the idea of not just the prevalence of entrepreneurial activity in small and micro, small and medium enterprises, but their growth. So I'm reminded of something that Adil Malik once said, and the MENA is a place where young firms can grow and old firms don't die. And I think this is something especially we see in the case of Kuwait and the data that was presented. You already have a small number of micro, small, and medium enterprises, and they're the first ones to fold in the context of a crisis. So being able to become sustainable and grow, that's where employment is created, that's where growth is really created, is key. And she touches a little bit on this, and I hope she can expand a little bit on it in the context of the policy recommendations. Let's see. Again, I would go back to suggesting if they can get additional data a few months from now, or like now this has been a year out, or maybe 2 years out, and then take a look and see what actually happened. One thing I was curious about is to what extent some of the policy decisions of these firms, such as reducing the number of employees or cutting benefits or unpaid leave, took into account those firms that closed. So to what extent were there selection issues involved? Basically, you know, in terms of the firms that actually survive are the ones that took those decisions. I didn't see that in the paper, the drafted paper I have, but maybe she can shed light on that. So I think those are a few comments and reflections that I had, and I thank the authors for 2 very excellent papers. Thank you, Dr. Omar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nader, especially for being so concise and for maximizing the value of those comments. We have one question in the Q&A, which is from Ms. Amal Hussein from Egypt. He says, thanks for the effort made in the presentations, which confirmed that all studies indicated the results from the coronavirus, but what we need is a presentation of the policies and mechanisms that get us out of this crisis as quickly as possible and how to put these mechanisms into practice. I understand that probably both authors would have spoken about that had they had more time. We probably don't have enough time for more questions. I'd like to give you a chance to reflect on Dr. Nader's comments. So I'd like to give you each 2 minutes. This time I'll start with Dr. Amira. You have 2 minutes to respond to this question and Dr. Nader's comments, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Nader. So to answer your last question, all these results pertain only to those that are still open. So of course there is a selection issue. Those that are closed are just closed. They disappear from the data. We only know that they closed, full stop. Any other information pertains to those that survive. You're absolutely right about this literature, growing literature out there about that young enterprises or small enterprises do not grow in our region, but this has exactly to do with political economy issues of barriers to entry. And this is also another thing that this presentation, while it's very descriptive, is also showing very clearly. You know, smaller firms face a lot of barriers to entry into markets. There are structural issues that prevent those firms from entering the markets and from surviving into the markets. I will very briefly share with you the last slide about the suggested reforms. Where I basically that the Kuwaiti people should start to earn their living, and that the government has to consider ending the public employment guarantee scheme and the type of welfare state that it has. There is a welfare state in the Nordic countries, but it does not take the same form as the the welfare state in Kuwait, which crushes entrepreneurial skill and activity, etc. Kuwait has to think about undertaking some regulatory reform to strengthen the framework of accountability, whilst, for instance, the competition law was enacted in 2009. Until 2017, it was not implemented entirely. There is a new public tenders law as of oops. As of 2016, yes, which will govern the award of public investment projects, and we're hopeful that this will help towards improving competition. But basically, regulatory reform needs to strengthen the framework of accountability for public procurement, tenders, and bidding processes. The franchising law to date is unregulated and requires a political will to overcome the entrenched interest in the parliament to pass. It is still governed by the Commerce Law of 1980, which gives very generous entitlements. Kuwait needs to liberalize and lift legal monopoly restrictions, which were also presented. It happens in Kuwait. And for sectors that will remain in public hands, Kuwait needs to conduct a public sector reform and better public financial management to harden the soft budget constraint and to discipline government-dependent public businesses. Kuwait needs to enact reforms to ensure the transparency of the use of the country's oil wealth, from joining the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, from enacting oil and gas sector transparency laws to show the contracts, the government and the company's contracts, and put them in the public domain. It needs to run public consultations on the management of sovereign oil funds. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Omar. I think many of the points you made, although Kuwait is different to all the GCC countries are unique, I think many of the recommendations you made apply to other GCC countries too, albeit to varying degrees. Now I'd like to give Dr. Sulaiman Al-Qudsi the chance to respond. 2 minutes, please, Doctor.
Okay, thank you. 2 minutes, or 2 minutes of Dr. Amira's minutes. Now then, let me just jump to what Dr. Nader said about the representation of the other surveys. Yes, we are cognizant of the fact that the CO was more meaty and we focused on it, but there were focused objectives that we were after from having the household survey, for example. Because we have as part of the study, a component on households and their consumption under Corona, as well as investors actually, and how whether that change, did their consumption change under the Corona environment, and if so, in what areas? Okay, we found that yes, number one, many households, particularly the rich ones, changed their consumption habits to ordering online. All right. And also changed some of the composition of consumption towards perhaps health and recreational types, for example, having recreational tools and equipment at home rather than going to clubs and what have you. There was, we got a sense of that's going to persist in the future, okay, because of the hesitancy, the risk, the health to their risk that they perceive. All right, so that's the reason for having the household survey, and for data for the labor force survey. The labor force survey, our objective was very specific. we had a purposeful sample of relatively well-educated Kuwaitis and non-Kuwaitis, because we wanted to restrict it to the occupations where Kuwaitis would be willing and able to take the place of non-Kuwaitis. And when we compared the labor force survey results, findings, with what the CEOs were telling us, we found that there were congruence, that there, in fact, what the CEOs were saying is repeated, not repeated, but rather is echoed in the labor force survey. The CEOs wanted to train people. The laborers said, we wanted to be trained, okay? The CEOs were saying, we are not hiring Kuwaitis because they are expensive. The workers were saying basically the same, and in terms of actual wages and benefits that they were getting actually. So, but you are right, and we do need to team up with the statistical agency, the statistical bureau in Kuwait, and we have extended our arms and hands to them, and in fact we trained them on aspects of time series analysis, on how to convert annual data into quarterly data, for example, and so on and so forth. But sometimes there is resistance, and there are budget constraints and inertia, if you will. But we will indeed continue our efforts to try to. After all, this is one of the reasons that for the Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research is to be exemplary in the context of the environment and culture in Kuwait. The productivity, is it? Yes, there is. Productivity is the name of the game. And does the government see it? And does the government do something about it? The point that Dr. Amira was dwelled on in terms of the social contract is really extremely important. The social contract maybe was relevant 50 years past, but for the coming 50 years, the social contract has to be amended, has to change. That's for sure. Okay, people have to work hard and creatively. People's search and seeking for quick money and the Dutch disease type of problems has to stop, because the government is really has been in a bad shape. And the coronavirus revealed that very clearly in many ways. And unless the average citizen, the student, the teacher, the family, the worker, the employer, the government employer, or worker, unless they realize that there has got to be a change in their performance, that their performance matters, that we have to learn and make our living from human capital formation and working hard and working creatively and innovatively. It's existential. This is what it is. Unless that is conveyed, felt, practiced by everybody, it'll take a long time where we are now.
And with that, we have to close the session, Dr. Sulaiman. Thank you to you for your paper and responses. Thank you, Dr. Amira, for your paper and responses. And thank you especially to Dr. Nader for his insightful reflections. For those who had questions and didn't get a chance to answer them, I apologize. Hopefully you can communicate directly with the authors. With that, I will hand back to Ms. Shireen Ghanem to take us into the next session. Thank you.